Hi, just wanted to let you know that I'd actually recorded a pretty long video and then realized it should be broken into two parts. So, this first part one is going to cover the main currencies involved when you're actually learning to code. So, the three types of costs that you have to incur when you're learning to code. And the second video will talk about what you should expect to be the true cost to you of learning to code. And I express those true costs in terms of the three types of expenditures or currencies that we're going to talk about in this part one. So you should watch both of them together. See you there.
Hello there! Welcome to my channel. Listen, after more than 12 years as a lawyer, I tried to start my own company. It was a startup and I was a non-technical founder. Sure, we managed to get a product to market, but you know what? I had a horrible time finding technical co-founders. In fact, I found a couple, but they ended up leaving. I was so sick of it. At the age of 37, I finally taught myself to code. But man, it wasn't easy. A year or so later, I ended up joining a startup as an engineer. And a year after that, I joined Google as an engineer. So listen, if you want to transition your career into tech, or you want to become your own technical co-founder, subscribe to my channel.
Now, there are multiple pathways, as you all know, about how you can learn to code. And that's kind of part of the problem. There are so many pathways that it can be quite overwhelming, quite confusing, and inefficient in many ways in your journey to code. So by the end of this video, I'll give you my framework for understanding how to invest time, money, and energy in learning to code. And I will give you my suggestions on what you need to optimize for. So stick around and let's get into it. Now, as you can see, I'm going to try and experiment with a slightly new format of presenting this information to you. I don't necessarily need to do it this way, but part of the reason I'm doing it this way is so that you can see exactly how I reason through it, how I approach the question of how best to teach myself to code. And keep in mind that I had given up 3 times before I finally managed to succeed to learn to code on the 4th attempt. And that was over many years, right? So this sort of framework or this thinking that I'm sharing with you is very much, I'm riffing, I'm doing it live, and I'm trying to remember all the things that I went through in those 3 to 4 years and the challenges I faced. So in the course of this, it's not going to be the smoothest, it's not going to be the most slick video, but that's okay. You know, the whole point here is to give you useful information based on my actual direct experience, this path that I've walked. As you know, the best way to get any help is from people who've actually done what you want to try and do. And that's why I'm here, to try and help you walk this extremely unusual path that I walked. So this is not necessarily going to be the most smooth experience, but you know what, let's have some fun with it and leave some feedback in the comments if you think this actually works as a format or not, or you think I could do something differently or better. I know you guys were really committed, are much more interested in the content rather than the style of presentation. Anyway, so hopefully you guys can see what the screen's got up here. I've got a little Jamboard. And today I'm going to talk to you about the true costs of learning to code. There are 3 currencies that I think are at the heart of what we try and spend. And when I say currencies, I mean literally the currency. These are things we spend in order to get something in return. Now, the most usual currency, of course, is money, right? Everyone knows about money. The next one that not many people think about is time. And then the next one is energy, right? Most people really, when they think about spending something, they're thinking about money, maybe time, and very few people think about energy. But the number one winner is always money. That's what we think about. That's what we think about saving, and that's what we think about spending. We don't really think about the other two so much. And that, by the way, I think is a mistake. So when it comes to teaching yourself to code, I believe that the correct formula that worked for me was understanding that I had 3 currencies to spend. Okay, so let's talk about an example. Now, when you think about it, most people put all their focus on reducing money, right? Nothing wrong with that. That's the number one thing that everyone thinks about. And the impact of that is that by trying to reduce their expenditure, I believe you end up increasing your time or time spent. So the less money you spend, the odds are the more time you're going to spend in exchange. So this is my big doubt about just relying on free resources, is that no doubt it's the cheap one. There's no question about that, right? It's the cheaper one. but it's also expensive in terms of time. Why? Because you get stuck a lot. You don't know where to start. You don't know how much is enough. You get very distracted by all these millions of questions like, do I do this stack? Do I do that language? Many of which, by the way, are irrelevant for your goals, but you don't know that. And so you spend a ton of time. Now, time and energy, right? This guy here, time and energy are incredibly connected, right? You can't spend time, or rather, you can't spend energy without spending time. So you think of a classical education where you go to university and get a degree. You can't help but spend time, right? You have to spend a certain amount of time. And with that time, you have to spend a lot of energy. There's no getting around it. Whether it's 1 year or 3 years, you can't get around it. And it costs money, right? So the classical education system is, it takes all three of these. Now, obviously, the less money you spend, the more time you end up spending, therefore, the more energy you end up spending. So this one here goes up as well, right? So that's the first situation where you try and save on time. Now, let's look at a second situation where you are looking at, well, maybe you want to save time instead and not save money. So what you want to do is reduce the amount of time. Now, this means that you're spending less time lost. You're not spending your time in wasted effort. You're not spending too much time in getting stuck. You're not spending too much time switching between topics a lot without really getting deep at the good ones, the ones that are important to you. And most importantly, you're not actually spending time on things that take you closer to your goal. That's the biggest waste of time, is when you're doing things that seem important and attractive, but aren't actually relevant or necessary, and definitely not sufficient to get you to your goal. Like, that's the biggest waste of time. And often I see people spending months and months and months. Like, one of my favorite examples is one of the students I coached who spent a whole lot of time switching away from Python and looking into C in order to get better at data science, right? Why? Because Python's implemented in C, and a bunch of people told him to really understand and get faster at machine learning and AI, you need to use C. And maybe there are use cases for that. But his first goal was to learn data science. His second goal was to get a job as a paid data scientist, and neither of which require C, and it's not sufficient to know C. So it's not sufficient, it's not necessary. So why do it? So when you try to save time, what ends up happening is, obviously, you end up reducing the amount of energy, because time and energy are very closely linked. So you end up reducing the overall amount of energy. So if you spend 1 year instead of 2 years teaching yourself to code, that's half the amount of energy that you normally would have spent over 2 years. But sometimes, in order to save time, you end up spending a bit more money. Now, if there is a way to get to your destination by plane or by train, if you can afford it and time is important to you and you want to reduce your time expenditure, you'll spend money on the plane to get there faster. That's how businesses work. Now, the third example, or the third scenario, is when you want to reduce energy. When you try and save on energy, you generally try and put in less time. However, there are situations where, by following the most efficient path that is tailored to your goals, tailored to your learning style, it's just easier. So you may spend, let's say, 5 hours a day. Let's just say 5 hours a day teaching yourself to code, but you're doing it in a way that makes you come alive, that excites you, that even when there are discouragements and disappointments, you're still motivated. Well, you're spending much less energy. If you're miserable, that 5 hours can be very exhausting. But if you're happy, that 5 hours can be extremely energizing. So even though the time and energy are quite closely related, there's a quality to the energy, right? So you want to reduce bad energy, reduce friction. You want to stay joyful. You want to stay curious and really interested in your work and motivated. You want to retain that motivation. And so in order to reduce the bad energy, the wastage of good energy, what do you do? Well, obviously, overall, that'll make you more efficient. And generally, to do that, again, it costs a little bit of money. Why? Because you're getting either the guidance or the structure or the assistance you need to make sure that your motivation stays up, your focus stays up, your productivity stays up, your momentum stays up, and overall your experience is positive, which means you'll get more done. So when you really analyze all this stuff, right, what this ends up looking like is you end up starting to think like an investor. And this is the principle that I really want you to think about, which is you want to think like an investor. You are the CEO of your own life. There is no question about it. You are the main investor, the lead investor in the startup of your life. You are also the CEO. So for you, you've got to try and think like an investor. So what does that actually mean? When you look at your three currencies, money, time, and energy, you want to invest these in the optimal way to produce the results that you want as soon as you can. In other words, you want an ROI. You want a return on investment. So if you want a return on investment and you have three currencies, now, like every other investor, you may have more of one currency than the other. You may have more time, you may have heaps of energy, or you may have a mix of money and time. Most people, and this includes me for the first 3 years of trying and failing to learn to code, is even though I had the money, I was unwilling to spend it. And I'm not talking about huge amounts here, but I'm talking about big amounts, right? Or let me put it this way. We so accustomed to free information and getting cheap courses on learning to code that we forget that learning to code is actually not the hard part. Like anyone can learn a language, but becoming a programmer is not the same thing as just learning a language. Learning to code in the sense that you actually mean it is being able to produce the outcome you want, whether it's your own startup, your own MVP, or getting your first developer job. To do that, learning a language is not enough. You need to learn a system of things. You need languages, you need a little bit of frameworks, you need to understand a bit about how the back end works and the front end works. And all of these are completely different topics that go into the box of learning to code. And most people think that because a JavaScript course or a Python course is, $100 or whatever it is, that learning to code is cheap and easy. It's not. In terms of time and energy, it takes hundreds of hours to get to the entry level for a developer job. Hundreds of hours, right? And if you try to do it for free and cheap, you're often using outdated resources and you're using resources that are very time consuming.